afternoon, good morning, everybody who's coming into the Zoom space. I am delighted that Douglas Lee has said he would participate in this conversation. I'm going to share some photos in a little bit so that you can see what we're talking about when we're talking about this island. And I, in fact, first encountered Doug via Facebook, of all things, of social media. Doug is a 64 grad, Russian studies graduate at Brown in anthropology, was one of the first of the Peace Corps volunteers going to Cameroon, and has spent his career portion of his life in the DC area as journalist, also working with politicians and all those things that those people in DC get involved in. And soon we're going to find out how he went from DC to this Southern Caribbean island, which, by the way, there is, you might hear rain in the background. There is a tropical storm that is in the vicinity, and it was almost a big question mark if Doug was going to be able to have internet today. So in fact, that might be, if we're talking about the pluses and minuses of living on an island, that might be right there in terms of the downside. And Doug, these are only 10 photos, and they're just a sample that I culled from your website. But before we actually get underway, feel free to make a comment if one springs to mind. This I just did a screen capture from Google Maps so that you can actually see where the tiny island of Bequia is located. Let people know, Doug, how big is the island?
7 square miles. Unlike its spelling, it's pronounced Bequia.
Bequia. Thank you.
Forget the spelling. That's looking west at the sunset.
That's a recent photo.
It's looking at dawn over the Atlantic. Yeah.
What did you say, Bequia? It might be apocryphal, but what does it supposedly translate as?
Island of the Clouds. And there's some doubt that's been introduced by a few cynical people here. Sparky is the one with the white coat, and Buddy is her friend, her boyfriend, her beach boyfriend.
I'm going to leave this as a teaser. One of the things you'll find on Doug's Facebook are videos of his dog and her friends romping in the water, along the sands. And in fact, if you need anything to sort of relieve anxiety, depression, a bad mood, one of these videos will certainly give you an expression of absolute unbridled joy. So, is that you?
No, that's someone else. But I took the picture. But that's I just like the lighting on that. That's the corner of our house. That's kind of like a prow of a boat, sort of headed northeast, sort of aiming toward Barbados out there, and then beyond that, North Africa and Portugal and those areas.
That's a black and white shot, though, that's showing you the view along the beach.
Do you see that very small little shadow of an island right off the point, the dark point? That's a much better known than Bequia. It's Moustique, which is where the wealthier classes tend to gather. And that was really started by the British royal family more than anything else. This country is in the British Commonwealth still.
It's another, that's your house, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Sparky and a rainbow, double rainbow.
That's an island across the channel. It's right near Mustique, and it's an internationally important flyway, or it's on the flyway for birds going up and down the Atlantic seaboard. And it's important, even though it's a small island, because it's almost inaccessible. So the birds are safe and can nest and rest and all those things there.
Same view, just different light show.
That was actually taken from an airplane as I was heading into the little airport at Bequia. It's a small plane airport, and that's looking south toward Grenadines, the next country. You can't. It's a little foggy, so you can't see Grenada, but normally you could.
And I've deliberately not included the ones that show the harbors filled with boats and the more built up part of the island too.
Right.
So.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's quite recent. That was about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago.
So Doug, so why don't so you said the magic words when you got there. I'm going to throw you the question that will allow you to share your story, share your journey of, well, how did you get there?
It was opportunistic, an accident. We lived in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, northwest of Washington, 50 miles northwest of Washington, much closer to Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. And in that small village, we had a friend across the street who had friends who had a boat. And somehow we got connected and we sailed with them a couple of times. And the first time we were in the British Virgin Islands, Joost van Dyke, and we loved it. It was a little island, and the local people were playing music and cooking barbecues and things like that. And the people we were on, whose boat, our friends who had the boat, said, well, if you like this, you ought to come back next year and we'll go see Bequia, which is our favorite. And next year we landed in Martinique, and they picked us up and we came into Bequia, and my wife is a painter and an artist painter. And she didn't even leave the boat. She started painting the very quaint little scene that unfolded itself in front of us, the tableau, if you will. I took the boys ashore and we roamed around, but Julie stayed there painting, and she started coming back regularly. I came back often, but she was really committed. And so, in a sense, I followed her to Bequia. I had other kind of fantasies occasionally about what I would do when I got older, but this was an option with very little resistance, with few barriers, because Julie became part of the furniture of the island, really, and so it was an easy transition when we decided it was time to leave. I don't know, we were a little jaded, I guess. I certainly was tired of working in Washington and among the people in Washington. So, and we had some changes in our family that sort of made it imperative that we do something to get out of a kind of a rut.
So what was actually involved in terms of, the actual degree of difficulty or?
Well, it was step by step. It was kind of a gradual thing. We really didn't decide to move here until we had actually sort of moved in, and then wondered what we were going to do with the house we still had in Virginia. So we bought a house finally in 2005. This house, and we still had the other one, and we tried to rent it, but nobody seemed terribly interested. And eventually, we sold that one. We still got a couple of cemetery plots in that little village, but that's about our only real roots back in the States. Um, Meanwhile, as I said, my wife had been coming here quite regularly, and she had established an art gallery and studio, and had become well known in her own right, and had developed an art business here. So it was fairly easy for me to kind of move in and do what I could do around the, her activities kind of formed. She was more programmed than I was. I guess that's one way to say it. I was looser and did various kinds of gigs, if you will, to keep some income coming in and to keep my wits sharp and stuff like that. So,
Because you said, or you shared with me that the house itself that you bought wasn't like here you are coming in with the big bucks and buying. Let's say it was a modest.
Yeah, it was certainly modest in price. That's why we could afford it, and it was derelict. It had basically been occupied by after the first family sold it back in the 60s. It was built in the 60s. It had been owned or occupied by a series of basically bachelor elderly white males, alcoholics even, and my wife wanted. It was just fine. It was isolated. It was quiet, and just perfect. I was still doing writing for various politicians and projects and stuff, commercial writing, and she was producing art, and most of it was sold on the island to visitors. There's a tourist season during the winter months, starting just before Christmas and going through Easter and beyond a little bit. So you can sell art and artifacts during that period. And I did most of my work, writing and editing, required good internet connection, and luckily that came in right at the right time. And I even had resources. I could subscribe to the New York Times and the other sources of information that I could feed off of. So it was kind of a serendipity of sorts that sort of everything worked out. We gradually let loose of our roots in the state as we gradually built up our roots in the Southern Caribbean, or in Bequia itself. And I don't know, and here we are later.
So is that still doable? I mean, was it 2005 that you moved? The idea that you can sort of make your entry without necessarily being the gazillionaire, is that still doable?
Oh yeah, I think it is. You need to do a little research and maybe spend a little money trooping around, looking at things and places, and sort of figuring out what you're comfortable with. There are inconveniences. I mean, just like the shaky internet is inconvenient, but I guess it's no more inconvenient than living in Tornado Alley or something like that. And that we're at the really the tail end of the global supply chain. You know, if you like a particular kind of toothpaste, and you might well find there's only one and it's not yours here for months at a time. So you have to adapt to that kind of relative deprivation. I mean, there's nothing like a Home Depot or an Office Depot or anything like that here. You tend to scratch around and make do. I mean, there's a lot of making do, which actually is an attraction. I mean, I find figuring out stuff, and eventually having to settle for making do, pretty pretty interesting, actually. It keeps your brain alive at a time when it's obviously declining at a certain age.
So Manju Prasad asked a question. Manju, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. You said you can work on the internet and read New York Times and stay in touch. How consistent is electricity?
That's
Have your own supply.
we have occasional outages, we have occasional planned outages in which the electrical company is putting in some new equipment or upgrading equipment or something like that. It's not too much. It's a little worse than in the state than what your expectations are in the States, but not much. I mean, it's pretty close. Our electricity went out briefly. It flickered last night when the storm was moving in, but it held up until, I guess, after we went to sleep. It was apparently off for a while after that, but we weren't inconvenienced by it.
You don't have your own generator?
We don't. There are people who do, but they've got. It's never been so inconvenient that I would be desperate for. And usually it's quite local. If we catch the brunt of a storm or repairs to the electrical lines or something like that, we're up on the northeastern corner of the island. I can go down to the harbor and find a little restaurant or something that has Wi-Fi and electricity, obviously. And it's the island's only 7 miles long, so the outages and the internet outages tend to be localized, highly localized.
So you talked about sort of this can do and sort of figuring things out and talking about establishing friends on the island. What is the community like?
Well, the local population, the population that's born here and lives their lives here, is majority African descent. There's actually quite short compared to Cuba or the States or Brazil. Slavery was only a little more than one generation long. So, and the emancipation of the British territories and colonies was in the 1830s. So, and this island was turned over from France to Britain, to the UK, at the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which was American independence also. So it wasn't that long. So there's no kind of heavy burden on the shoulders of those people. I mean, they aren't the kind of weighed down with that history. And then there were some, just as in Trinidad, there's a fairly substantial minority of people from the Indian subcontinent who came in after emancipation of the Africans to do a lot of the physical labor in the sugar fields and there was arrowroot here, and there was what's the blue color? I'm having one of those moments. Anyway, there were a number of kind of commodity agricultural products that various people, the French and the British, tried, but mostly they weren't successful because you can have 4 or 5 great years, and then suddenly you'll have a long dry season or something and just wipe out any kind of commodity agriculture that you might be undertaking. So it became, in the late 1800s, there was a crash in the most of the commodity markets, and people here were on the edge of starving, and they developed an onshore whaling industry. Bequia still to this day has one of the exemptions to the international ban on whaling. They rarely catch one, but it's still possible here, and it's a matter of great contention, as you might suspect. But back then, the protein from the whales was really important to keeping people alive during that time of troubles like that.
So let me see, there are 3 questions, but I'm actually going to, if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to sort of leapfrog to the question that seems most relevant to what you were just talking about, and then come back to the others. Manju, do you want to ask your question again? Manju asks, how is the wealth gap? Does it affect law and order?
Only recently. Well, I mean, we've compared to the wealth that is over on Mustique. The gap is not that great here. Recently there have been some constructions of fairly ostentatious houses, but it's not really a problem to that extent. And a lot of the people that come here feel an obligation to try to do what they can. They get involved with improving the hospital, or they try to contribute in one way or another to the school system. And it's kind of hands-on. They tend to become part of the furniture here. That's an expression I've learned to love lately. And you're not so obviously there are no gated communities or anything to set off people. If there is an expensive house here, it's usually cheek by jowl with a poor person's house, and it's and you know the gamut or the spectrum of complexions of skin colors is really amazing. I mean, there's one family, a lot of people and they have the same last name, and they run. When you see them on the street, you can't tell where their ancestry is, because some of them look like Norwegians and some of them look like Senegalese. I mean, it's just one family. It's just astonishing when you see the diversity and the variety. So that tends to reduce, if not totally eliminate, a lot of the obvious distinctions that would create class or ethnic or other kinds of divides. It tends to force people. At one point, apparently before the schools developed and mixed a lot of kids from different areas, there was some segmentation of the various populations. There were families of former indentured servants, often who transitioned through Barbados. They were actually known as white slaves. They were indentured, but they never worked off their indenture. And they tended to find a distinction between themselves and the African descendants. That disappeared with the arrival of schools, where kids got to know one another, independent of any skin color or background. And it's really minimal now, as far as I know. I mean, you know, here I am. Look at me. I may be speaking out of with blinders on myself.
Right. So and crime, is there crime?
It's very, very petty kind of property crime. There's really no person-to-person violence to speak of. Once in a while, somebody gets drunk and does something crazy, but they're not. We don't see a lot of weapons of any kind. actually harpoons are the last drunken murder I heard of was some guy shot another one with a harpoon. It's
Ouch. So,
that was about 10 years ago, I think.
so in fact, that may in fact be a great segue to Seth's question. What about medical care?
That's the most common question. And that's where the risk, if you think of it as a triage, I mean, if something chronic and long-term happens, we will have time to rearrange and move to where, world-class medical care is available, like in certain parts of the States. If it's sudden, it kills you quickly, we're as dead in the same way that we'd be dead back in Virginia. It's the middle third where a few days might make a difference if you had a stroke, for example. And if you could get immediate care for that, that would possibly save you from living a miserable life afterwards. That's where the risk lies, and that's the risk we took. It's being reduced every year steadily as more and more equipment, more and more well-trained doctors are coming here, and quite good medical care is just a short flight away in either Barbados or in Trinidad. So there are risks. The local hospital is quite small, but my wife spent most of a day there recently, and she was cared. I couldn't improve on the care and attention she received at all, and all the usual tests and the kinds of analytical tools were available too. It's not what you're used to in a big city, a wealthy city in the States or in Europe. But that's one of the things I actually like about it's part of it can be, if you can flip it, you can see it as part of the simplification of life here too. Simplification carries costs, or at least sometimes carries costs, and that could be one that might bother you. My Yale roommate became an oncologist, and I told him one time, I said, sometimes I'll be talking to somebody on the street, some local person, and they'll seem just fine. The next day I'll learn they died overnight. And as an oncologist, he's used to treating people over a long haul. And I said, I think I might prefer to go that way than be under your care for several years. It's just, I mean, I'd hate to generalize about that, and I'm not sure what I would do if the crunch came. But it's interesting. I mean, there are people who learn to live with certain things that are probably not tolerated in the States. I would imagine sometimes you see some very ancient people walking along with canes or something, and you think, well, if that was an American, a middle-class American with osteoarthritis or something like that, they would have their knee replaced or their hip replaced or something like that. And these people use a cane and they get along okay. I mean, it's not optimal, obviously, but life is pretty simple. You don't need to optimize everything.
So in fact, I wondered when you said you were going to flip it, I wondered if, on the other hand, potentially a healthier lifestyle means that you don't need medical care as much.
That is a strong possibility, and we both noticed. I mean, the air comes right off the Atlantic, and it's 4,000 miles to the nearest real landfall. And the water comes. The rain you hear today is going to be my water over the next dry season, because it comes down and hits the gutters and then it is downspouted down to down to our cistern, which is about 25,000 gallons. Instead of a basement, we have a waterproof, watertight cistern where we store our water that comes in the rainy season, which is now. And so there's not any pollution there. There's no treatment. There's no added chemicals or anything that might have dire consequences if you had too much of it.
Casey, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, sure. I was just curious, like how many steps or how long it takes for you to get to like a large airport that could maybe get you to mainland US? Like, is that a full day or is it just a couple hours?
And you have a two-parter, and what is your second question?
Oh, my second question was kind of a joke, but I was wondering if your local health department was hiring.
Well, actually, we have really highly trained Cuban nurses and doctors and pharmacists here. It's really quite. It's part of their soft foreign policy is to contribute medical care around the world. I mean, we're not by any means a sole practitioner, but we've had wonderful Cuban doctors and nurses and the pharmacists. They become real friends. So I don't know how many spots are open after the Cubans fill whatever their quota is. That's your second question. And the first one is we take a puddle jumper from the Bequia airport to Barbados or Trinidad, which is an hour away, each of them about an hour away. Or we can go over to our big island called St. Vincent. It's a 10-mile ferry ride to the island and then a short taxi ride to the airport, and that connects directly to Miami and New York, and Charlotte, I think, and also Toronto and Montreal, I think, also. There are a lot of Canadians down here, by the way. I think there are more Canadians than there are Americans or Brits or anything. It's really quite amazing. You know, the Caribbean used to be a kind of an American sea. And that was why you had people like the Castros and the Chavezes and the Sandinistas and Bishop and all those people emerged and had popular support. But now the American presence down here is just very quiet and very minimal. If there's any foreign influence, it has, and of course the Russians disappeared out of the Caribbean too. If there's any foreign influence that predominates, it's Canada, Canadian. They have a lot of influence here, and in Cuba and other places where there's no American influence.
So how much development is there?
It's pretty steady. It's keeping a pace with world population growth. When I used to come down here once a year or twice a year, I would see the housing going up the mountainside as you came into the harbor. And it was kind of a rough gauge of world population growth and Bequia population growth. So there's construction is a major industry here. I don't quite understand what they think is going to happen when they develop every possible square foot of land.
So is there any kind of activism, like a pushback against any of that?
There's a little bit of rhetoric that pops up from time to time, but not really, nothing significant. There's concern among the wealthier foreigners, but I think the concern is largely overblown. There's a little bit of concern. I mean, it's really quite minimal. It's a pretty friendly place to perch. And I guess that's one of the attractions. We didn't articulate that or put it on a list of reasons why, but we knew it was a friendly place from the first moment we stepped on the island.
So what would you say, well, maybe I was going to ask you know, because we talked about the medical, what would, you know, if we look at the question one way, like what would be the biggest adjustment for somebody who might want to move to an island like yours, or looking at it another way, what kind of person, what kind of person does one need to be to live on an island like you do?
Maybe a little bit of a sidetrack. Neither my wife nor I are kick the tires kinds of buyers of cars or houses or anything else. It's all emotions. And if you love something, you go, whatever the risk. You don't really sit around and start articulating. If you're like us, I'm talking about people like us. Right? If you're not like us, you would probably think about it differently. But we just haven't been terribly concerned about an ultimately unknowable future. So we just do what seems interesting and doable. And yeah, it takes some care eventually. I mean, we're not foolhardy. We're not recklessly impulsive, but certainly we're not inhibited either from doing this kind of move. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, it sounds like you adapted well. How do you think it's changed you? If in fact you now were going to talk to that young man who was at Yale, what would you tell him?
I don't think I'd tell him anything. I'd let him live out his life the way he did, either following this path or some other path. I don't think advice from someone who's pushing 80 to someone who's in their early 20s is going to hold much water. And you know, the circumstances are really different. I mean, I'm just amazed at how much you when you get to a certain age, you really think differently and act differently but you can't hold yourself to a standard that didn't exist when you were back then. It's basically what I've always done is kind of when a crook in the road comes up, I look and sort of figure out what looks most interesting or fun or rewarding in some way to me. And I just don't think I would have any useful advice for
So
that guy.
I'll flip the question. What do you think that you take or bring from having gone to Yale College? What do you think you bring to the island, or bring to your experience of the island, maybe more correct?
Well, when I got to Yale, it was like I felt like I was home in some way, that I'd finally found my brothers and sisters. Not so many sisters back then. There was Hillary Clinton was in law school. That was what Yale did for me then, mainly in kind of an academic setting with academic tools and goals and rewards, was legitimize my curiosity, which was not always legitimized going through the Houston, Texas public schools as a boy, as a teenager. And that same legitimizing holds true to this day. And this was exotic enough and different enough, like being in the Peace Corps in Cameroon or in the Amazon for field work or any. It actually encouraged me to be curious and to take hard courses, for example, in the academic context of Yale, with a sense of adventure. And that's what that sense of adventure still obtains here, in the sense that today, because of the storm, you didn't know whether the vehicle was going to be inspected. So you don't know a lot of these things. There are contingencies at all times, and that's kind of exciting. It keeps the brain alive, I think, at an age when it really wants to shut down and rest. And that's what being in a somewhat, I mean, it's not so exotic that I'm incapable of coping without all kinds of risky help but it's exotic enough to encourage me to try out things in the same way I did courses at Yale that were not in my major or anywhere.
So you're saying to the Yaleys that are a part of this Zoom, that when you go to the island, you bring yourself with you, and you get to know more yourself than maybe you ever did.
Yeah, and remember, that's an evolving self, an aging self. What you bring changes. What your inventory of what you bring changes all the time because it's additive. You're contributing more and more to it, and so the embarkation point was really good. I mean, I was charging ahead in 1964 at graduation. I was ready to go, and I was going to Africa. Wow! And then my wife and I together sort of came to the conclusion that, we wanted to do something a little more challenging, a little more exotic. I've used that word a lot lately. It's not all that exotic. It's not all that exotic. There are Russian oligarchs' yachts out in the harbor, so it's not all that exotic. Probably under sanctions now. They're probably anchored there forever.
So you moved at a time when you were starting to untangle yourself from your career. Do you think it's possible for more people, like we're understanding now that we don't have to work at the office? Do you think it's a realistic goal for somebody who wants to be fully enmeshed in their professional career with the main office in Chicago?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's one of our best friends comes down several weeks a year, actually, and she is a vice president of Penguin Random House. And during the pandemic, she learned to stay isolated out on Cape Cod. And so being on Bequia is very similar to that. And she's actually looking around now for a house to move to. She has no particular love of staying in Manhattan. So
which is an island.
That's right. Cape Cod is almost an island.
So anything.
Yeah. I had a stray thought, not that I was going to act on it, but I thought, well, when the pandemic first hit in March of 2020, that there goes our property values if we ever needed to cash in, you know, long-term, you know, chronic illness or something requires a lot of expense back in the States or something. I thought, well, there goes that. But in fact, the phenomenon we just talked about, it took a couple of months, but all of a sudden the property values started going up again. And that was because the people had realized that they could work from a place like this. Certainly not the only place they were doing that, but it became at first necessary and then an advantage in a way. I mean, when I think about all the time I spent commuting into Washington, whew, and all I did, you know, was write and edit. I mean, I could have done that out in my little village in Virginia. And instead, I was driving 100 miles each way every day for 45 years or so.
But what would you say to discourage people from doing that?
From going someplace remote or
yeah,
different.
Yeah.
Well,
And I would problematize that a little bit. Is this another, the latest form of sort of colonization? Not to be too heavy or anything.
No, I think there are some people who think that. And I've noticed, I mean, little indicators. This is the anthropologist in me, I suppose, but I've noticed as recently as a decade ago, there was virtually no tipping here at all. I mean, and, you know, people would look and say, "What's this? You gave me too much," or something, and try to give it back to you. And that's all changed now. Now tipping is here, and it's largely because of the North Americans and the Europeans who flock here mainly mainly during the winter, but increasingly for longer periods, 6, 8 months, even like us, full time. And there are subtle influences going on all the time, but it's not in the colonial sense of being in charge of the colonial power being in charge and dictating everything. I mean, there's a lot of consultation, a lot of meetings, a lot of cultural conflicts. I mean, not armed conflicts or anything antagonistic, but just misinterpretations, the anthropological sense of culture clashes and differences. And you have to be aware of that and be able to be tolerant of that, I suppose. And ultimately, they're in charge. I mean, that's true. They are in charge. It's not like Martinique and Guadeloupe in their relationship to the metropole in France. You know, the Vincentian government is in charge, and that annoyed some of the people during the early pandemic when they were requiring them to wear masks and social distance, and some of the people on the yachts didn't like being told that at all. But a lot of us who knew it was the right thing to do because the government was trying to protect us, basically. We ganged up online and put them back in their place, basically. There's this American influence. It's called American. It's no longer American at all. It's kind of late stage international capitalism, I guess. The way. I mean, it could easily be more pronounced in Tokyo or Shanghai or someplace like that these days, but still called the American influence, the Americanization of formerly separate and different cultures and people, and that's being globalized and internationalized and homogenized, I think, and there's some of that here too.
Right. So if somebody here is maybe inspired and they're thinking about, well, maybe I will come to the island, maybe I'll check it out, or another island. What would you say are some of the steps that they should take? Like having been somebody that's done it and knows the things you did right, or possibly, you know, the things that you, you know, now you know you should have done it another way. What would you recommend, or that somebody is saying, yeah, I'm going to act on this?
I think it's exposure. I mean, I think you go and stay in some kind of shelter that you can afford for a few weeks, maybe the first time, a few months later on, and you pick up things like, oh, it's really awful to build a house here. Everybody who builds from scratch, you know, it takes 5 times as long as they thought, a lot more money, a lot more pain and suffering, if you will. And I feel we lucked out. We bought a derelict house, which is probably, we've been patching it ever since. And that turns out to be a lot easier to do than trying to bring a house in, a new house, newly constructed, in on anything like a deadline or a budget. It's just out of your hands. It just quickly, you lose the reins. And the team of horses is running at their own pace in whatever direction they're going, and you're just barely sitting in the cart. So I'm really glad that we didn't do it. Once again, we didn't kick the tires. We found this house we loved, and it was instantaneous, just like the little house in Virginia we had for so many years. I think it's there are other people who come in and they buy basically in the first hours on the island. They see something they like and they buy it. Very few of those people stick around very long. And they may even have said, well, I can live here part-time and I can rent it out or something like that. Well, you better check out what sort of places are renting at what price and what people do to your property when they rent it, in the sense of ownership they get. We were warned off by some of the people who owned rental vacation villas, and said, one person in particular said, Doug, you have no idea what even very wealthy people will do to your property if they think they have a sense of ownership. So that warned us off, and that was good advice too. So you have to expose yourself to, you have to listen, basically. Maybe that's the simple way to say it. You have to put yourself in a position where you can listen and try to understand. You'll never completely understand or pin down all the loose ends, but you can gain a little confidence the more time you put in before you make a decision like that.
Great. So anything else? We're coming up to the top of the hour. Anything else you'd like to share with us before we say goodbye?
No, I sometimes try to think, what would I be doing if nothing had changed? And I think I'd be bored if I had not changed. I mean, it's hard to bore me because as long as I have a book around, I'm pretty happy guy. But there's a lot of the unexpected happens here. It's not threatening; it's just unexpected, and you can cope, or you can cope well, you can cope badly, or you can kind of let it drift. I mean, things are more articulated in a way. There's less taken for granted in your life. there's less less that you can rest easy on. Does that make any sense at all?
Yes. Yes. As somebody who's gone backpacking, and the the idea of suddenly realizing, oh, water that comes out of a tap, I can relate to the idea of not taking something for granted. So, but thanks very much, Doug. And yes, if anybody has any questions for Doug after the event. Well, now we're going to be signing off, so you probably won't catch it in the chat. But once again, I encourage you to befriend Doug on his Facebook group if you happen to populate that territory. You can continue the wonderful side, the relaxing side of life there. I have to put in a plug. I'm segueing now, Doug, to what's coming up next in 2 weeks. Also on a Wednesday at 1, we are going to have a panel of teachers talking about learning during the pandemic. Hopefully we're going to sort of pull out some of the positive or the lessons learned. At least this might be a good opportunity for parents and guardians to come and see what they might even be doing for their youngins, even at this moment during the summer. Then the following, well, not the following, 2 Wednesdays later, we're going to have Ellen Bora come back, psychiatrist who's just published a book on the anatomy of anxiety, a new perspective based in the body rather than simply brain chemistry, but she was a previous guest that prompted much interest. And then we'll have 2 shows in August. So tell your friends, tell your neighbors, and hope to see you again at another one of our Careers Life in Yale featuring spotlighting alumni and their insights and experience. So hope that the storms have passed you by, Doug. And I was going to say, have a great, wonderful rest of your day, but I'm sure you will. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming.